I'm Keshini Navaratnam. Welcome to Reporters, where we look at some of the stories our correspondents around the world have been following. Robin Denselow finds out why the poor farmers of Tanzania can't afford to send their children to school. And Matt Fry goes to see the widows of the Pol Pot regime who are still waiting for justice for the crimes committed. We begin with a report from Robin Denselow in Tanzania, a country like many others in Africa which is being forced to spend far more on debt repayment than education. Tanzania's problem is particularly bad, with a debt of more than £4.8 billion.
It's an important day for Tanzanian education. 37 years on from independence, the East African state now has its own open university, and this is the first graduation ceremony. Sitting alongside President Mkapa is the guest of honour, Julius Nyerere, Tanzania's first president. He spent his political life supporting the liberation struggles in southern Africa and stressing that true liberation at home could only come through education. As president, he declared the goal of free primary education for all, and almost achieved it back in the late 70s. Now the country's in debt, and that goal has been abandoned. Nyerere is known to his countrymen as Mwalimu, the teacher. Today he's awarded an honorary degree, Doctor of Letters. And he warns that primary education, the only education that most Tanzanians receive, is in crisis.
The instrument of domination of the future is going to be education. If therefore we do not want to be the permanent source of the hewers of wood and the drawers of water of the educated of this world, we must seriously enter this honorable competition for knowledge. At present, the quality of our primary school education is appalling.
And this is the appalling reality that Nyerere warns of. Isundu Village School out in Tanzania's farming heartland. It has 207 children, aged from 7 to 15, and 4 teachers. The day starts with the national anthem. And once that's over, there's a little financial business to attend to before lessons begin.
Mwalu William.
The new school year started in January, and pupils who haven't paid their fees are summoned by the headmaster. The sums they owe may seem negligible, translated into sterling, but these are the children of often desperately poor subsistence farmers who find it hard to find £3 a year for school fees and further contributions for desks or uniforms.
Kasimu Juma.
It can come to nearly £12 per child.
Twendeni.
Those who haven't paid are sent home. For Kasim Juma and these other children, being excluded from school is a common experience. Today, 8 of them will get no schooling. Kasim is 14. He lives with his parents by their maize field just a few hundred yards from the school. His 10-year-old sister, Mariam, hasn't gone to school today. Her fees haven't been paid either. For the farmers here, survival depends on the weather. It's estimated that 40% of the population face food shortages. Last year, with El Niño, there was severe flooding, and the previous year there was drought. Kasim's father, Daudi Juma, is one of those who've suffered as a result, and he's now 2 years behind in paying his children's school fees. And yet, by law, his children must go to school.
As you can see, this is a very small farm and I only grow maize. I don't have any cattle. The soil here is poor, there's a drought, and I'm unable to get together the money for my children's school fees.
Back at school, those who have paid don't get a great deal for their money. The buildings are dilapidated, which is not surprising. Government spending on education has been cut by 2/3 in a decade. There are few books and in this classroom no desks. The children sit on the dirt floor. 5 years ago there were no such problems. Education cost parents virtually nothing. But the country was heavily in debt. It owes nearly £5 billion. And the government put up school fees a massive 2,500%. And they've doubled every 2 years since then, far higher than the rate of inflation. Tanzania spends 3 times as much repaying its debt as it does on education. And it's argued that if that goal of education for everyone is ever to be achieved, that debt has simply got to be cut back. It's a problem that concerns Oxfam's Godfrey Wiwa, who studied the situation at Isundu and other schools right across Tanzania. He sees a direct connection between the crisis in education and Tanzania's debt. The country's economic policies now have to be agreed with the IMF.
Not many parents are able really to afford the school fees. This whole question of cost sharing, which was imposed to us by International Monetary Fund policies, it has affected very much, mostly the poor parents. And we know over 50% of our people are very poor, in fact, living below the international poverty line.
And school fees don't just affect parents and their children. Non-payment of fees brings other problems for Isundu's headmaster, who lives with his family in a little compound on the edge of the school. If he doesn't deliver all the children's school fees to the authorities, his own salary is cut back. So he's under constant pressure to get parents to pay up.
I act as a tax collector, apart from my profession as a teacher. My family normally suffer because if my salary is being taken to compensate the fees from the parents who don't pay, the necessity of my family could be lost.
The headmaster has one sanction as he tries to extract fees: the School Parents Committee. It's a makeshift court made up of teachers and villagers involved in the local administration, and today they've assembled to hear the case of Daudi Juma. He explains he has no money and asks the committee to be patient and give him more time to pay. But his request is denied. He's ordered to pay double the amount he owes in school fees and a little extra for having taken up the committee's time. If he doesn't comply, he could face the district court, which has the power to send him to prison. After the hearing, he told me that any penalties they imposed would make no difference. He still couldn't and wouldn't pay.
If they take me to court, I will agree to go to prison, as long as my children can go to school. If I am sent to prison, I'm sure that my family will have problems.
Those who don't obey the committee suffer the penalties, as Abbas Tungu found out. Last year, he was found guilty of not paying his children's school fees, when the fees were half what they are now. The village militia arrived and seized his bicycle as payment.
It means that I can't go to work the way I used to. When I had the bike, it was easy for me to go to look for manual work, even if it was far away. But now it's difficult. I can't even meet the family's normal requirements.
Tanzania ought to be a success. It's avoided the upheavals and bloodshed that have cursed so many of its neighbours. But development has been set back by famine, AIDS and debt. Further south, we stopped at the little town of Singida, out in the farmlands on the road between the capital and Burundi. Here too, the debt burden has hit the schools and brought social problems normally associated with the big cities. In the centre of town, there's a large abandoned building site. It was going to be a regional headquarters for the ruling party, but they ran out of money. Today, it's occupied by street children. There are now an estimated 200 of them, just in this little town alone, living rough and with no schooling. For Tanzania, as for much of the developing world, this is surely the greatest problem of all. Children growing up without education, training or proper jobs, highly vulnerable and quite likely to drift into crime. It's argued that the IMF's policies, forcing the government to make huge increases in school fees, are making the situation even worse. Just outside town, there's a centre for former street children supported by Oxfam. The children are aged from 7 to 16, and here they get food, which they prepare themselves, and an education. But there's only room for 30 children, a fraction of those still living rough in town.
They are writing with their pens. Now,
Some became street children because of poverty at home or because their parents had died, often from AIDS. Exclusion from school for non-payment of fees is increasingly another reason for children leaving home.
Exercise book and your pen.
Almasi Simbu ran away and became a thief because his parents couldn't afford to feed him or pay his school fees.
I wasn't going to school because my school fees had not been paid. Every time I went to school, I was beaten because my fees hadn't been paid. That's one of the reasons I went onto the street. The other reason was poverty.
Flying back to Dar es Salaam across this vast, empty land, one has a sense of a country almost at a standstill. Nothing seems to be moving. The crisis in education will surely have a long-term effect on development. And for the moment, there's no sign of that changing. The country spends more on its debt repayment than it does on education and health combined. Back at the Open University, the degree ceremony is followed by a party on campus, with Julius Nyerere the guest of honour. Tanzania has changed enormously since he retired nearly 14 years ago. His experiments with socialism and a welfare state have been replaced by a market economy and growing charges of corruption. Pushing through the crash to meet the country's leaders, past and present, I asked Tanzania's teacher why he feels that education has become so appalling.
You don't have the resources. Not that the president doesn't want to spend money on education. He wants to spend money on education. But if you are spending 35% of public revenue to service debt in a poor country like Tanzania, where do you get the money to pay the civil service, to pay the police, and then have money to improve your education? And one of the easiest things that the rich countries could do for countries like Tanzania is to abolish that debt.
But that all depends on the IMF, whose assessment team arrives in Tanzania next month. If their report is positive, that Tanzania has correctly followed the agreed economic policies for the last 3 years, then the country's individual creditors have agreed to cut part of their debt. But there'll still be no relief on the debt to the IMF and World Bank until after a second 3-year term in 2002, and that's not guaranteed. At the IMF's Dar es Salaam office, a decision's promised by the end of the year. But granted the crisis in the country, shouldn't they just be cancelling the debt?
Tanzania has to move away from being very dependent on aid, as the government itself has said. And we should not give the false impression that only if we wrote off all the debt of Tanzania, all problems will be solved. I think that is an inaccurate picture to project.
But surely if some of the debt at least was written off, that money saved could be put towards education and health where it's so crucially needed.
We are all working very hard towards obtaining as much relief as possible for Tanzania. However, there are constraints that we all face.
What does it mean to the World Bank and the IMF? Bookkeeping. But to these people, it's education, it's health. It means a lot.
So, if I can ask the President, when you meet the IMF later this year, how much pressure are you going to try to put on them to reduce the debt urgently?
I've been putting it on them for the last 3 years in which I've had an agreement with them. No, we'll try to argue their case. But the best we can do is to argue a case. It's up to them to decide.
I mean, under the present agreement, it would be, what, at least 3 years, maybe
Yes.
2 years before you get any relief?
At least 3 years.
What will the state of education, of health and so forth be like in Tanzania after 2 or 3 years?
Terrible. Do you know, I have now about 20,000 teachers that I should be hiring for primary school education, but I cannot. That should give you the measure of the problem that we have. They are trained by us, ready to improve the quality of education in primary schools, but I can't hire them.
Back at Isundu, the headmaster desperately needs some of those unemployed teachers that Tanzania can't afford to pay. As parents struggle to find school fees for their children, he knows they're not getting value for money,
I don't have enough teachers. We are only 4 teachers, while we are supposed to be 8 teachers. So also is a problem.
And what's all this going to mean for Tanzania if children aren't going to school or they haven't got enough teachers?
We expected that most of the Tanzanian will be ignorant.
How do you think Tanzania will develop?
It can't develop because education is a key.
Tanzania will learn later this year whether or not the IMF agrees a further 3-year economic programme and if that will lead to debt relief. For the children of Isundu and all those others whose futures are damaged by the crisis in Tanzania's schools, it's surely crucial that there is rapid relief and a guarantee from the government that any savings made are spent on priorities like education.